The last video for evolution is going to be on speciation. Just as a side note, if I sound distracted, it's because Fred the turtle is staring at me this whole time and it's distracting me. So I thought I'd put a picture in just to prove that he really is being weird and staring at me. So there you go, there's Fred the turtle, and he's distracting. Anyway, what is a species? A biological species is defined as a group of organisms that are capable of successfully reproducing. It's a good definition, but a relatively simplistic one. It's limited in its application. It's really hard to apply in nature. Sort of variety of examples. You can think of organisms that are capable of asexual reproduction. That does not make them not a species. Also, there are hybrids. One example, we have two different types of crows. You can have a carrion crow or a hooded crow. These two are actually capable of reproducing and thus then producing what we would consider a hybrid, a mix between two different species. And the question is, so what is a hybrid? Is it its own species? Is it part of the original? Which one? So the point is that the definition of a species, while sounds pretty, is actually difficult to apply. Speciation is the formation of a new species, and there's a couple of different ideas about the way that speciation occurs. There's the gradualism idea, and that's that species are the product of slowly accumulating small evolutionary changes, and that's this first sort of wiggly lines picture. Looks really pretty, takes time, nothing's distinct. That's gradualism. There's also punctuated equilibrium, and this is the idea that species undergo long periods of time with very little change, followed by rapid, large evolutionary changes. The likely sort of answer is that actual speciation occurs in both of these ways. It can be gradual, it can follow the punctuated equilibrium. One sort of definition of punctuated equilibrium, goodness gracious, you can think about extinction. So you have a major extinction and you wipe out a group or groups of organisms. That leaves a lot of areas for other organisms to come in. So it leaves some niches open, allowing other organisms to come in. And that's typically when you see some speciation. Along with that, if you do have a lot of diversification happening over a short period of time, that's often referred to as adaptive radiation. There, in general, tends to be different standards for the way that we might define adaptive radiation, but it means that there's an event in which the lineage rapidly diversifies, and the newly formed lineage is evolving different adaptations. The rapid diversification of mammals is shown, not mammals. Here we've got the rapid diversification of various different types of fish. So one species evolves into many species to occupy open niches. The speciation process, this is the way that speciation might occur when you have two populations that can become reproductively isolated from one another. Remember, sort of going back to the definition of a species is that they are capable of reproducing. So you consider a speciation event has occurred once those organisms are no longer to reproduce together. The speciation, again, I guess I sort of repeating this, occurs when no population can interbreed with any other population. Two different ways. You can have allopatric speciation, that's due to a physical separation, or you can have sympatric speciation, and that's when they're still occupying the same area, but for whatever reason, they're no longer able to breed. Allopatric, again, here's a good way to sort of think about it. You've got the original population. In allopatric speciation, there's some type of barrier that's formed, and they are isolated. And once you put them back together in the end, they are no longer able to reproduce. In sympatric, generally, instead of a barrier, you have some type of genetic change that happens within the population and eventually get to a point in which the two different populations are no longer able to reproduce. There's a variety of different barriers to species. We, in general, break them out into prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. Prezygotic barriers to speciation. Temporal isolation, this would be if you have two different populations that are reproducing at different times. Habitat isolation is exactly as it sounds, like one is in one area and the other is another. Behavioral isolation in general means that the behaviors associated with reproducing are so different amongst the two different populations that they are unable to reproduce. Mechanical isolation is the mechanics involved in reproduction no longer is compatible. And then gametic isolation is the gametes themselves cannot successfully join. So that's prezygotic. So that's before the gametes have formed the zygote. But you can also have postzygotic barriers, and that's when the egg and the sperm have combined. These are reduced hybrid viability, meaning the hybrid itself is no longer, it cannot survive. Reduced hybrid fertility, the hybrid cannot make it have its own babies, and then hybrid breakdown, which is, as it sounds, the hybrid is not going to live into a reproductive age. All of these things are barriers that would prevent producing viable, fertile offspring. Classic example is a mule that's crossed between a donkey and a horse. Generally, most mules are not able to reproduce, although there actually have been some documented cases of mules that were able to reproduce, which is kind of interesting. One of the sort of classic textbook examples of speciation, I got a cough, hold on. I paused it so you didn't have to hear that. Okay, the classic example of fruit fly speciation is in this example here. Sorry, I got distracted again, the turtle. So initially we can have, and this experiment was done to sort of provide evidence of speciation, and it was done by Diane Dodd, and she looked at the effects of geographic isolation and selection on fruit flies. So she took fruit flies from a single population and she divided them into separate populations, so they're living separately in different cages to simulate geographic isolation. Then she went on to provide half the population with a maltose-based food, and the other half the population lived on a starch-based food. And she allowed them to go through generations, and just as a note, that's what makes fruit flies, one of the things that makes fruit flies so great for research is that they reproduce very quickly. So it's not like she's waiting years and years and years. This happens quickly. So after many generations, the flies were then tested to see which flies they preferred to mate with. So she had them separate, allowed a bunch of generations to pass, and then she allowed them to get together. Dodd found that some reproductive isolation had occurred as a result of the geographic isolation and selection for different food sources in the two environments. In general, the maltose flies preferred other maltose flies, and the starch flies preferred other starch flies. We can't be sure that these differences didn't exist prior to selection, but is a good sort of result we would expect if allopatric speciation was an actual mode of speciation. And that, my friends, will do it for evolution videos.